This part 2B. This lecture is taken from Gardner's Art Through the Ages, A Concise Global History. This is Chapter 1, Prehistory and the First Civilizations. Part 2B, Ancient Near East, and we're going to cover briefly Akkad, Babylonia, and Assyria, three important civilizations. And my name is Julia Schlosser. All right, so we're going to start with the Ancient Near East and the civilization of Akkad. The Akkadians their civilization lasted from 2332 to 2150 BCE, and they produced the earliest known life-size hollow cast metal sculptures. In 2334 BCE, the loosely linked group of cities known as Sumer, so remember in the first part of this lecture we talked about the civilization called Sumer, and basically what we're going to see is that each civilization is in power for a while, and then a new civilization comes in, a new group of people goes to war with them and then dominates them, and then eventually they get dominated. So we're going to kind of see a series of civilizations. So in 2334 BCE, the loosely linked group of cities known as Sumer came under the domination of a great ruler whose name was Sargon of Akkad, and he was in power from 2332 to 2279 BCE. Someone can do the math to see how long he was in power. And under Sargon, and in Akkadian his name means true king, and his successors, the Akkadians introduced a new concept of royal power. So this is based on unswerving loyalty to the king rather than the city-state. So their expectation was that you were loyal to the king who was in charge rather than to the place that you lived, to the city-state. And then Naram Sin ruled from 2254 to 2218 BCE, and he was Sargon's grandson, and he regarded himself, he regarded the governors of his cities as mere royal servants. He called himself king of the four quarters, in other words, the ruler of the earth, and thought of himself basically as a god. So Naram Sin has this very, kind of elevated sense of his own place as the king of the four quarters, the ruler of the earth, and almost the same as a god. All right, so here's the head of an Akkadian ruler. This is from the city of Nineveh, which is in modern-day Iraq, and this was made between 2250 and 2200 BCE. It's made of copper, and it's a little over a foot high. So you can see it's almost, the size of a head. And you can see that the eyes have been damaged. When the next ruler fought this ruler and won, they went in and damaged this to show that this ruler was out of power and then the new ruler was coming in. The sculptor of this oldest known life-size hollow cast sculpture, so this is about the same size as a real head, and it's made of copper, and it was cast it's hollow cast, which means that the inside is not solid copper. It's much lighter than it would be if it was solid copper. The sculptor captured the distinctive features of the ruler, and again, this was defaced in antiquity a long time ago. All right, so the Akkadians introduced this new concept of royal power. This is based on unswerving loyalty to the king rather than to the city-state. And this is a magnificent copper head portraying an Akkadian king, and it embodies this new concept of absolute monarchy. The head is all that survives, so this was originally part of a sculpture. It was knocked over in antiquity to make a political statement. The enemy forces not only toppled the Akkadian royal portrait, but they gouged out the eyes. These would have once been inlaid with precious or semi-precious stones. They broke off the lower part of the beard, and they slashed the ears. And you guys can think that this still happens today during the Black Lives Matter movement protests. We saw on the news knocking over, racist statues of Confederate generals, statues that stood for, really embodied racism in these in the Black Lives Matter protests, those would be knocked over. So this idea of knocking over a portrait to sort of show that that person's no longer in power is still a powerful, statement today. All right, nevertheless, the king's majestic serenity, dignity, and authority are evident. So too is the masterful way that the sculptor balanced naturalism and abstract patterning. So this is really a new way of picturing people. His face looks very natural, yet he also has a lot of abstract textures going on. Look at the way the beard is so beautifully made, and it's so symmetrical, and the pattern is repeated over and over again. So it's both naturalistic, in other words, it probably looks like what this man looked like, but they also have this really great abstract patterning going on. The artist carefully observed and recorded the distinct profile of the king's nose and long curly beard, and brilliantly communicated the differing textures of flesh and hair, even the contrasting textures of the mustache, the beard, and the braided hair on the top of his head. So all these, his mustache is going to be a little bit different than his beard, is going to be a little bit different than his hair, which is braided up here. So it's really a beautiful portrait. And this is the oldest extant life-size hollow cast metal sculpture. So the oldest existing life-size hollow cast metal sculpture that we know of. And the head demonstrates the sculptor's skill in casting and polishing copper and engraving the details. So it's, really quite a lot of artistic skill went into this portrait. All right, and the sculptor captured the distinct features, and again, this was defaced in antiquity. All right, so now we're moving on. We're still in the Ancient Near East. We're still in the civilization called Akkad, and we're moving on to another piece of art called the Victory Stele of Naram Sin. And this is pink sandstone, so it's carved out of sandstone. And I just want you to picture, this is 6 foot 7 inches high. And so a very tall basketball player would be, about as tall as this sculpture. So it's a very tall sculpture. Some of the things we've seen have been very small, but this, on the other hand, is very tall. If you stood next to this, unless you're very tall, this is going to go above your head. All right, to communicate, so we're commemorating the conquest of the Lullaby. So this is another civilization, and Naram Sin, remember, is the grandson of Sargon, and he had a battle against these other people, and he won. And then he commissioned this. He set up this stele showing him leading his army up a mountain. And so here he is. Again, we're thinking about hierarchy of scale. So the tallest person is the most important. And here's Naram Sin. And we're going to again think about he's wearing a headdress with horns. And so what does that mean? And you can see that he's leading people up this landscape. So the sculptor is staggering the figures. And remember, we've been used to seeing things in this register format, like on the Standard of Ur, things are in a very, in these 3 bands. But this is totally different, right? The king is leading these people up this mountain. Again, kind of a breakthrough in art making. All right, and Naram Sin is wearing this horned helmet, and if you remember from before, we said that the horned helmet indicates the presence of a god, and so this is the first time that a king appears as a god in Mesopotamian art, and Naram Sin regarded himself, right, as a god, and so he has himself depicted with this horned helmet, which means that he thinks that he is a god. All right, so the godlike sovereignty the kings of Akkad claimed is also evident in the victory stele that Naram Sin set up at Sippar. And a stele is a carved stone slab erected to commemorate a historical event or sometimes to mark a grave, but in this case, to commemorate this historical event. Naram Sin's stele commemorates his defeat feet of the lullaby, and this is a people of the Iranian mountains to the east. And he wears the horned helmet, signifying divinity, the first time a king appears as a god in Mesopotamian art. All right, so the sculptor depicted the grandson of Sargon leading his army up the slopes of a wooded mountain. His enemies fall, flee, die, or beg for mercy. You can see that they're begging for mercy here. Here are the soldiers, and then some of the enemies have already been killed. The king stands alone. He's far taller than his men, and he's actually standing on the bodies of two of these lullaby soldiers that Naram Sin's army has killed. He wears the horned helmet the first time. He appears as a king, and at least 3 favorable stars shine on his triumph. So the stele is damaged at the top, but you can see these are the stars, 1, 2, and then 1 would have been up here. And these are all shining down on the king, because he has been triumphant. All right, and so then again, you can see by storming the mountain, Naram Sin also seems to be scaling the ladder to the heavens. So this is the same idea that lies behind the Mesopotamian ziggurats that we saw, that they're moving up closer to heaven, right? The taller they are, the closer they're getting. His troops march up the slope behind him in orderly files. This is suggesting the discipline and organization of his forces. And in contrast, the lullaby are in disarray, right? They're in all of these different varieties of poses. One is falling headlong down the mountainside. So up here we can see those stars that are shining. Here we see Naram Sin with his horned helmet. Here we see some of the lullaby people begging for mercy. Here we see somebody who's been killed and is falling down. And then over here we see his troops who are very orderly. So there's again that contrast between the people who won the war and the people who didn't. All right, the Akkadian artists adhered to older conventions in many details, especially by portraying the king and his soldiers in composite views. So again, remember, their heads are in profile, their bodies are facing us. This is that the composite view idea, and placing this frontal 2-horned helmet on his profile head. But the sculptor shows daring innovation in creating a landscape setting for the story and placing the figures on these staggered levels. And so again, this is like such a common thing now that we would have like a painting with somebody standing in a landscape, but this is really the first time that we see this in an artwork. So again, a kind of an amazing innovation on the part of whoever this artist was, 1,000 years ago. This was a bold rejection of the millennium-old compositional formula of telling a story in a series of horizontal registers. All right, and again, it doesn't mean that people stopped using the horizontal registers, but it does mean that this artist was pretty daring at the time that they made this, and was definitely thinking outside the box. All right, so this is showing divine kingship and its attributes. The man is a great leader. He's conquering the enemy, and the stars are shining on him, and he's basically a king. This is showing warfare. It's showing cuneiform, so I can't see it right here in this picture, but if you find other views of this, you can see that there's writing on this that tells about his exploits, and all over the back there's writing as well. And the writing at that time was called cuneiform. And hierarchy of scale, which again means, everybody should be thinking of what this means right now, because this is definitely a question on the quiz. Hierarchy of scale means that the largest figure is the most important. It's not just, doesn't mean they're just happen to be the tallest. It means that for the purposes of this picture, they are the most important. It's a composite view, which is showing both profile and frontal views. We've also talked about that before. And it shows organization versus disarray. So who is organized? Of course, the Akkadian soldiers. And who is in disarray? The lullaby who lost this. And again, this fantastic thing of putting people in a landscape, really for the first time. All right, so let's conclude the Ancient Near East, the civilization of Akkad, which lasted from 2332 to 2150 BCE. The Akkadians produced the earliest known life-size hollow cast metal sculptures. That was that beautiful copper head that we saw. And in 2334, the loosely linked groups of cities known as Sumer were defeated, came under the domination of Sargon. And under Sargon, there was this new concept of loyalty to the king, not to the city, state, not to the place you live, but to the king himself. So this is kind of a new thing. And then Naram-Sin regarded the governors of his cities as merely servants and called himself the king of the four quarters. Again, this is the first time that we're going to see a Mesopotamian ruler think of themselves as a king. And then for the victory stele of Naram-Sin, remember, hierarchy of scale, the composite view, and also the first time that they're putting people into a landscape in an artwork. All right, and we looked at the head of the Akkadian ruler. We looked at the victory stele of Naram-Sin, and now we're moving on. All right, we're moving on to Babylon from 2150 to 1070 BCE. Around 2150 BCE, a mountain people brought an end to the Akkadian power. So the Akkadians were in power for a while, but then they got conquered, and there was a period of political struggle. And then over a couple of hundred years, this traditional Mesopotamian political power of several independent city-states existing side by side reemerged and persisted. So things changed around until one of those cities, Babylon, succeeded in establishing a centralized government, so more like a country that we would know, and that ruled southern Mesopotamia in the 18th and 17th century BCE. So 1800 and 1700 BCE. So again, it's another kind of a big deal, uniting these city-states into one centralized government, more like a country. All right, and so again, Babylon 2150 to 1070 BCE, and we're looking at the Stele of Hammurabi. So this is from 1780 BCE, and this is another big deal. This is the law code. So here you can see, I mean, I know it's very tiny, but all of this, these markings, these incised markings are cuneiform, and they're all different laws that were ruling this society. So all of these, if you came, you could read this and know all of the different, like, what's going to happen to me if I cut down my neighbor's tree? What's going to happen to me if I do, X and Y? What are the consequences? So this is a law code, and again, we now have a written language, so we can read what these people wrote. Right, very different from the Paleolithic and the Neolithic period. The king is Hammurabi, and the god is Shamash. And so you can see the god is here sitting on the throne, and then he's giving this code of law to Hammurabi. And these are very much symbols of authority. This is put out so that people would know what the law is, and they would know who's in power, and that's Hammurabi. And the reason Hammurabi is in power is because the god that they believed in, they believed that the god gave Hammurabi the power. And this is the first time that we're seeing some foreshortening in the image, which is, again, kind of exciting. All right, so Babylon's most powerful king was Hammurabi, and he reigned or ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE. And he was famous in his own time for his conquests, but to us, he's best known for his comprehensive set of laws, which prescribes penalty from everything from adultery and murder to cutting down of a neighbor's trees. And Hammurabi's laws are inscribed on this black basalt stele. So again, it's a type of rock, and this was discovered at Susa in Iran. All right, so at the top, Hammurabi stands before Shamash, and we can tell that he's a god. He has flames coming out of his shoulders, and he has this amazing four-horned crown that he's wearing on his head. Plus he's sitting on a throne, so we know. The king raises his hand, so he is respectful of the god, and the god extends to Hammurabi this rod and ring that symbolize authority. So that's how we know that Hammurabi is in power. And the symbols are builders' tools. So these are measuring rods and coiled rope. And again, this would symbolize Hammurabi building this civilization, right? He is the builder of the symbol. They connote Hammurabi's capacity to build the social order, to measure people's lives, that is, to render judgments and enforce laws. So we are very familiar with laws today, but remember, this is sort of the first time that this is all being written down. So it's pretty exciting. All right, so the sculptor depicted Shamash in the familiar convention. So this is this combined front and side view, but there's two important exceptions. His headdress with its 4 pairs of horns is in true profile. So we don't see all 8 of the horns, but we just see the 4 on the side because he's in profile view. And the artist seems to, again, tentatively explore the notion of foreshortening. So this is a means of suggesting depth by representing a figure or an object at an angle, right? You can see he's kind of sitting as an angle toward us instead of just facing front or being in profile. So again, foreshortening is a tool that artists use all the time today. And here we see, one of the first examples of that. And this is on the Stele of Hammurabi from 1780 BCE. All right, and then you can see a close-up of it, and so there you can see Shamash with his horn, the 4-horned crown, and you can see what he's handing. He's handing the rope and the measuring rod to Hammurabi, and then he has this amazing beard that comes all the way down to the bottom of his chest. And again, this is 7 feet high, people. So this is, over most of our heads by at least a foot. It's very tall. So Shamash's beard is a series of diagonal rather than horizontal lines. And again, it suggests recession from the picture plane. So they're thinking about how can we portray the 3-dimensional world on this more 2-dimensional space, although it's not quite 2-dimensional. But the sculptor also depicted the god's throne at an angle, further enhancing the illusion of spatial recession. Things get smaller as they go back in space. And innovations such as these and the bold abandonment of the register format in favor of a tiered landscape on the Naram Sin stele were exceptional in early eras of the history of art. You guys, it doesn't mean that everybody gave up the traditional way of depicting things, but it is interesting to think about these kind of outside the box artists who are doing this early on. All right, crowning Hammurabi's law stele is the relief of the king, and again he's got the Shamash has these flames coming out of his shoulders. In case you wondered who was the god and who was the king, well, if you look at the flames coming out of his shoulder, you know that this guy is the god and this is Hammurabi, the king. Okay, so Ancient Near East, Babylon, 2150 to 1070 BCE. Hammurabi was the greatest Babylonian king. He sets up a stele recording his comprehensive laws, and they also think about the artist using foreshortening. So this is the artwork from Babylon. Right, and then we're moving on to the Ancient Near East. This is Assyria, and this is from 900 to 612 BCE. The Babylonian Empire toppled in the face of an onslaught by the Hittites. So this is an Anatolian people who conquered and sacked Babylon around 1595. So Babylon, Hammurabi in power, very powerful for a while, but he eventually gets, kicked out. They get taken over. The Hittites actually left. And then around 900 BCE, the Assyrians had overtaken Mesopotamia. So the new conquerors took their name from Assur, the city in northern Iraq, which was dedicated to the god Ashur. And at the height of their power, the Assyrians ruled an empire that's extended from the Tigris to the Nile and from the Persian Gulf to Asia Minor. So this is big area, broad area where the Assyrians were totally in power. So they, and this is happening between 900 and 612 BCE. All right, and so ancient sculptors insisted on showing complete views of animals. So this is a four-legged composite monster that guarded an Assyrian palace. And we can see that there's two ways you could stand in front of him and look at him, and you could see his two legs here. But if you stood on the side and looked at him, you also see four legs. So the lamassu, which is, he has the head of a man, and then the wings of an eagle, and the body of a bull. And this is from the citadel of Sargon II, and this is from Iraq between 720 and 705 BCE. Again, this is carved out of limestone, which is a rock, and this is almost 14 feet tall. So this is very tall. But it's this very interesting view. If you stand in front and look at the lamassu, you see two legs, which is correct. If you stand on the side and look, you see profile view, four legs. But if you count the legs, that means there are actually 5 legs on this creature. And so this was this kind of way that the artists developed to give you kind of a correct view from the front and from the side. All right, so how many legs does a lamassu have? Guarding the gate to Sargon II's palace at Dur-Sharrukin, and many other Assyrian royal complexes. So these guys, the lamassu, were around a lot. Were these colossal limestone monsters, which we think the Assyrians called lamassu. They have wings, and they have the head of a man, and the body of a bull, or sometimes a lion, and these were there to ward off the king's enemy. The task of moving and installing these immense stone structures was so difficult that several reliefs celebrate the feat. So they actually show men dragging these figures with the aid of ropes and sledges. So this is a huge task, to be able to weigh several tons, right? And to get these statues in place. All right, and so here the lamassu is again, and the two lamassu guarding the gateway of Sargon's Dur-Sharrukin palace are nearly 14 feet tall. But transporting these mammoth blocks from the quarry to the building site was not the only problem the Assyrian sculptors had to confront. The artists also had to find a satisfactory way to represent a composite beast no one had ever actually seen, right? I'm assuming most of us have never seen an animal that has the head of a man, the body of a bull, and wings. And they had to make this unfamiliar form intelligible from every angle. In other words, they wanted it to be correct if you looked at it from the front or if you looked at it from the profile. They came up with a solution that may seem strange to us, to modern eyes, but one which is consistent with the pictorial conventions of the age and perfectly suited to the problem. So for them, the 5 legs was a great solution. All right. The Assyrian lamassu sculptures, therefore, are yet another case of early artists providing a conceptual representation. So, most animals that we know of don't have 5 legs. So this is of an animal or person and all its important parts, as opposed to an optical representation of the composite monster as it would stand in the real versus the pictorial world. So again, if you saw this in real life, it wouldn't look quite the same. The Assyrian lamassu sculptures are partly in the round. In other words, you can almost walk all the way around them. You can walk from the front to the side. But they thought of them as reliefs. So these were kind of on these adjacent sides of a corner. And so they combined the front view of the animal at rest with the side view of it in motion. In other words, from the side, it looks like the animal's walking, but from the front, it looks like they're standing still. Seeking to represent a complete picture of the lamassu from both the front and the side, the sculptors of all the extant Assyrian guardian sculptures gave each of the monsters 5 legs, 2 seen from the front and 4 seen from the side. All right, so the Assyrians from 900 to 330 BCE, and they constructed fortified citadels guarded by the lamassu, and they carved large-scale reliefs celebrating their prowess in warfare and hunting. And the artwork that we've seen is the lamassu. All right, and so here is a list of the ancient Near Eastern artwork that we looked at from the Sumerian artwork and monuments. We looked at the White Temple, the ziggurat, the Warka vase, the Eshnunna statuettes, and the Standard of Ur. And remember, war side and the peace side. The Akkadian artwork, we saw the head of the Akkadian ruler. We saw the victory stele of Naram Sin. Babylonian artwork, we looked at the Stele of Hammurabi. And from Assyrian artwork, we looked at the lamassu. All right, and so this is the end of part 2B of our short lecture on the ancient Near East. Thank you.